Weathered hands. Josephine Palmer's alarm blared at 4:15 a.m., just as it did every morning. Her fingers, calloused and cracked from cleaning chemicals, fumbled to silence it before the sound could wake 8-year-old Daniel, sleeping in the next room of their small apartment. The pre-dawn darkness pressed against the windows as she forced herself from beneath the thin blanket. One more day, she whispered to herself, a mantra repeated so often it had become a prayer. By 5 p.m., Josephine was mopping the floors of the Westwood office complex, her body moving on autopilot while her mind wandered to Daniel's upcoming school science fair. She hadn't figured out how to get the time off yet, but somehow she would be there. She always managed, even when it seemed impossible. "Morning, Miss Palmer," called the security guard Hector as he made his rounds. "You're here earlier than usual," Josephine smiled, tucking a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. "Extra floors today. The Bradshaw firm is hosting clients. At 2 p.m., after 8 hours of scrubbing toilets and emptying trash, Josephine rushed to pick up Daniel from school, squeezing in a quick grocery stop before dropping him at Mrs. Morales' apartment for the evening. The elderly neighbor watched Daniel for a fraction of what daycare would cost, another small blessing in Josephine's precarious financial balancing act. "Homework before video games," Josephine reminded Daniel, kissing the top of his head. "I'll be back by midnight." By 4:30 p.m., she was tying the worn apron around her waist at Rosie's Diner, a small, 24-hour establishment that smelled perpetually of coffee and grilled onions. The dinner rush blurred into a haze of orders, refills, and forced smiles that made her cheeks ache. It was nearly 10 p.m. when the bell above the door jingled, and Harrison Reed walked in, punctual as always. He took his usual corner booth, the one with the wobbly table that other customers avoided. Josephine had noticed him weeks ago, not because he was particularly striking, though his thoughtful grey eyes and salt and pepper hair had a certain quiet charm. What made him noticeable was how he noticed everything else. "Evening, Josephine," he said, his voice gentle as he accepted the menu she handed him. "How's Daniel's volcano project coming along?" Something warm flickered in her chest. Most customers didn't even look at her name tag, let alone remember details about her son from conversations days earlier. "He's decided on a chemical reaction instead of baking soda and vinegar." "More impressive, apparently," she answered, surprised by her own smile. "A real one, not the practiced customer service version." "Smart kid." Harrison nodded. "Just coffee tonight, please. And maybe some company for a few minutes, if you can spare it." Over the next hour, between serving other tables, Josephine found herself returning to Harrison's booth. He asked about her day with what seemed like genuine interest, listening intently as though her stories of spilled cleaning solution and difficult customers were somehow fascinating. "You never mention what you do," Josephine remarked, refilling his coffee cup for the third time. Harrison's eyes crinkled at the corners. "Nothing nearly as impressive as balancing 3 jobs and raising a son." As midnight approached and Josephine untied her apron, Harrison left his usual generous tip beneath his coffee cup. "But tonight, there was also a small paper bag. A little something for Daniel's project," he said simply. "Just some materials that might help." Exhaustion momentarily forgotten, Josephine felt the unfamiliar weight of kindness in her hands. For the first time in months, the walk home didn't feel quite so cold. Small kindnesses, the science kit Harrison had given Daniel, proved to be more than Josephine could have afforded. Complete with a miniature lab set, safety goggles, and materials that transformed the modest volcano project into something spectacular. Daniel had beamed with pride when his demonstration earned him first place. The blue ribbon, now prominently displayed on their refrigerator door. "Your friend must really know about science stuff." "Mom," Daniel had said, carefully placing each component back into its case. Josephine had simply nodded, unsure how to explain the strange friendship that had been building between her and Harrison over the past 2 months. It wasn't romance, at least she didn't think it was. It was something else. Something built on quiet conversations and unexpected considerations. Tonight, as rain drummed against the diner windows. The usual dinner crowd had thinned early, leaving Rosie's eerily quiet. Josephine wiped down counters that were already clean, wondering if the weather would keep Harrison away. She told herself the disappointment she felt was merely about the lost tip. The bell chimed at 9:45 p.m., and there he was, rainwater dripping from his modest navy jacket. Harrison shook water from his hair like a dog might, making Josephine laugh despite herself. "Didn't think I'd see you tonight," she said, already pouring his coffee, black with 1 sugar. "Wouldn't miss our conversations," Harrison replied, settling into his usual booth. As he removed his jacket, Josephine noticed the frayed cuff of his shirt, an unexpected detail for someone who carried himself with such quiet dignity. Their evening ritual unfolded naturally. Between serving the few remaining customers, Josephine would return to Harrison's table, each visit lasting a little longer than the last. "Tonight," he asked about her weekend job at Sweetie's Bakery. "I've never tried their pastries," he admitted. "Then you're missing out," Josephine said, briefly allowing herself to imagine him there, among the morning bustle and sweet aromas. "Their almond croissants could make you believe in miracles." Harrison smiled. "I'll have to stop by sometime." The next morning at the bakery, Josephine nearly dropped a tray of scones when she spotted Harrison examining the display case with intense concentration. He looked different in the morning light, more rested, perhaps, but also somehow less comfortable, as though the cheerful yellow walls of the bakery were too bright for him. "The almond croissant, as recommended by the expert," he said when he reached the counter, his eyes warming when they met hers. Later, as she wiped tables near the window, she watched him bite into the croissant. The look of genuine surprise and pleasure on his face made something flutter in her chest. "Worth crossing town for," he declared when she approached to refill his coffee. "Though I suspect the company enhances the flavor." Josephine felt her cheeks warm. "Careful, Mr. Reed, that almost sounds like flirting." "Harrison," he corrected gently. "And perhaps it is." Their encounters expanded beyond the diner. Sometimes Harrison would appear at the bakery on weekend mornings, always ordering whatever Josephine suggested. Once he even appeared at the office complex with a thermos of coffee, claiming he had a meeting in the building, but somehow finding time to sit with her during her brief lunch break. The small intersections in their otherwise separate lives began to feel like anchors in Josephine's exhausting routine, moments where she wasn't just a worker or even just a mother, but simply herself, valued for her thoughts and her company. One Tuesday evening at the diner, Harrison arrived with a small package wrapped in simple brown paper. "For Daniel's birthday," he said, sliding it across the table. "You mentioned it was this week." Josephine stared at the package. "How did you remember that?" "I barely mentioned it." Harrison's expression softened. "I listen when you talk, Josephine. Not many people have that gift of genuine attention you give to everyone around you." That night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, clutching the astronomy book Harrison had given him, Josephine found herself wondering about the enigmatic man who had woven himself into the fabric of her daily life. She knew he worked in technology, lived alone, and preferred diners to fine restaurants. He spoke knowledgeably about everything from classical literature to quantum physics, yet never condescended. But there were gaps, significant ones. No mentions of family beyond a sister in Seattle. No specifics about his work. No invitations to call or text, though their conversations flowed as easily as old friends. The following evening, Harrison didn't come to the diner, nor the next. By the third night of his absence, Josephine found herself watching the door, a hollow feeling expanding in her chest each time the bell chimed, and it wasn't him. On the fourth night, just as she was losing hope, a young woman in an impeccable suit entered the diner, scanning the room before approaching Josephine directly. "Miss Palmer?" "I'm Olivia Thorne, Mr. Reed's assistant," she said, her voice clipped and professional. "He's asked me to deliver this to you." She handed over an envelope, nodded curtly and left before Josephine could respond. Inside was a handwritten note and 2 tickets to the Natural History Museum's special exhibition on space exploration, Daniel's Current. Obsession, the note read simply, "Something's come up. I'll explain when I return. Until then, the stars await you and Daniel." Josephine tucked the note into her pocket, unable to shake the feeling that Harrison Reed was not at all who she had believed him to be. Hidden Worlds, the Natural History Museum's space exhibition, exceeded every expectation. Daniel raced from display to display, his eyes wide with wonder as he absorbed information about distant galaxies and the mechanics of space travel. Josephine trailed behind, watching her son's excitement, while her mind kept returning to Harrison's mysterious absence and the elegant assistant who had delivered his note. "Mom, they have a real meteorite you can touch," Daniel called, waving her over to a display where other children were gathered around a smooth, dark stone. As Josephine approached, she noticed a tall man in a tailored suit speaking animatedly to the group of children. Something about his profile seemed familiar, though she couldn't place it immediately. When he turned, revealing his full face to the overhead lights, Josephine froze. It was Harrison, but not the Harrison she knew. This man wore an expertly tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His usual, slightly disheveled hair was perfectly styled, and a discreet security detail hovered nearby. Most jarringly, the other adults in the room were treating him with a deference that bordered on reverence. Before she could process what she was seeing, Daniel had already recognized him. "Mr. Harrison," he shouted, darting forward. "Did you come to see the space rocks too?" Harrison's professional smile transformed into something genuine when he spotted them. He excused himself from the group and walked over, the confidence in his stride markedly different from his usual unassuming presence. "Daniel, Josephine, what a wonderful coincidence," he said, though the slight tension around his eyes suggested it was anything but. An elegantly dressed woman approached, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Reed, the board members are waiting in the founder's room for your presentation on the new wing donation." "Thank you, Charlotte." "Please tell them I'll be there shortly," Harrison replied, never taking his eyes off Josephine's increasingly confused expression. "Donation?" Josephine echoed faintly. Harrison's smile faltered. "Perhaps we could talk after your museum visit? I could meet you at the cafe across the street around 4. Daniel tugged at her sleeve. "Can we, Mom, please?" Still reeling, Josephine nodded numbly, watching as Harrison was swiftly guided away by his entourage. "Did you know Mr. Harrison was famous?" Daniel asked, eyes wide with excitement. "I'm beginning to think I don't know him at all," Josephine murmured. The remainder of their museum visit passed in a blur. Josephine's mind raced with questions, piecing together fragments of conversations, suddenly seeing them in a new light. The generous tips, the vague descriptions of his work, the way he always paid cash. At precisely 4 o'clock, Josephine and Daniel entered the cafe. Harrison sat alone at a corner table, now dressed more casually in a simple button-down shirt. Though the quality of the fabric was unmistakable to Josephine's discerning eye, "Daniel, why don't you order whatever treat you'd like?" Harrison suggested, handing the boy a $20 bill. "Your mom and I need to talk for a few minutes." Once Daniel was occupied at the counter, Harrison's composed facade cracked slightly. "I owe you an explanation." "You think?" Josephine's voice came out sharper than intended. "Who exactly are you, Harrison? If that's even your real name?" "It is my real name. Harrison James Reed, founder and CEO of Horizon Technologies." He said it matter-of-factly, as though it should have little significance. But Josephine's breath caught. Even she, disconnected as she was from the business world, recognized the name. Horizon Technologies was a global leader in sustainable energy solutions and cutting-edge medical technology. Their headquarters dominated the downtown skyline, a gleaming tower of glass and innovation. "You're that Harrison Reed, the billionaire?" He winced at the word. "I prefer entrepreneur or engineer, but yes. And all this time at the diner, at the bakery. What was that? Some kind of social experiment? Slumming with the working class for entertainment?" The hurt in her voice was unmistakable. Harrison leaned forward, his gray eyes intense. No, Josephine, never that. He paused, choosing his words carefully. When you live my life, people see the wealth, the company, the influence, never the person. At Rosie's diner, for the first time in years, someone saw me, just me. You asked about my day because you actually wanted to know, not because I might offer you something. Josephine's anger wavered. Why didn't you tell me? Would it have changed things? He asked quietly. Would you have still shared stories about Daniel's school day or complained about your supervisor if you knew? Or would you have seen me differently, been careful, guarded, like everyone else? Daniel returned with an enormous chocolate muffin and a wide smile, temporarily halting their conversation. Mr. Harrison, did you know they named the new planetarium after you? Daniel asked, sliding into his chair. Harrison nodded, a flash of discomfort crossing his features. The company made a donation for educational programs. That's so cool. Mom, can we go see it next time? Josephine managed a smile for her son. Maybe, sweetheart. Eat your muffin. As Daniel happily devoured his treat, Harrison reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of touching Josephine's hand. I've been dishonest by omission, and I apologize for that, he said softly. But everything else, every conversation, every moment at that wobbly table, that was real. I'd like the chance to explain properly, without the public setting. He hesitated. Would you and Daniel join me for dinner tomorrow? At my home? Josephine studied his face. The same kind eyes, the same attentive expression she'd come to value. Yet now she saw the weight of responsibility behind them, the subtle signs of a man carrying far more than casual dinner conversations. Your home, she repeated. I'm guessing that's not a modest apartment above a bookstore. A small smile tugged at his lips. Not exactly, no. I'll need to find someone to watch Daniel. Bring him, Harrison interrupted. I have a telescope he might enjoy, and a rather impressive collection of science equipment that's gathering dust. Josephine hesitated, torn between lingering anger at his deception and curiosity about who Harrison Reed truly was behind the carefully constructed persona. One dinner, she finally agreed. But I have questions, a lot of them. I'd be disappointed if you didn't, Harrison replied, relief visible in the softening of his shoulders. And Josephine, thank you for still seeing me, not just what I own. As they parted ways outside the cafe, Josephine watched Harrison slide into the back seat of a waiting black car with tinted windows. The divide between their worlds suddenly stark and unmistakable. Yet something in his parting smile, vulnerable, hopeful, genuine, made her wonder if perhaps those worlds weren't as incompatible as they seemed. Building bridges. A dress Harrison had given Josephine led to an electronic gate nestled discreetly between mature oak trees. No ostentatious signage, no obvious security cameras. Just a simple intercom that Daniel excitedly pressed when they arrived in Josephine's aging Honda. Reed residence, came a crisp voice. It's Josephine Palmer and Daniel. We're expected? The gate slid open silently, revealing not the palatial mansion Josephine had imagined, but a modern glass and cedar structure that blended harmoniously with the surrounding woodland. It was undeniably luxurious, but with a quiet elegance that struck her as perfectly aligned with the Harrison she knew. This is like a superhero house, Daniel whispered as they approached the front door, which opened before they could knock. A woman in her 60s with a kind face and practical clothing greeted them. Miss Palmer, young Mr. Palmer, welcome. I'm Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper. Mr. Reed is in the kitchen. The kitchen? Josephine echoed, surprised. He insisted on cooking himself tonight, Mrs. Winters said with a hint of amusement. A first in the 7 years I've worked here. Following Mrs. Winters through the home, Josephine noticed the space was beautiful but lived in, bookshelves overflowing. A half-finished chess game on a side table, engineering journals scattered on surfaces. It lacked the sterile perfection of wealth displayed for its own sake. The kitchen, however, was a different scene entirely. Harrison stood amid what appeared to be a culinary explosion, flour dusting his shirt, tomato sauce splattered across the counter, and something that smelled suspiciously burned wafting from the oven. "You're here," he said, attempting to wipe his hands on an already soiled dish towel. I may have been slightly ambitious with the menu. Mrs. Winters sighed dramatically. I'll order from Georgia's, shall I? Probably wise, Harrison admitted sheepishly. Once Mrs. Winters departed, an awkward silence descended. Harrison seemed suddenly uncertain, a stark contrast to the confident figure Josephine had glimpsed at the museum. Daniel, oblivious to the tension, pointed to a wall of windows overlooking a sloping garden. Is that a workshop down there? Relief flooded Harrison's features. My lab, yes. Would you like to see it while we wait for dinner? Daniel looked to Josephine for permission, practically vibrating with anticipation. Go ahead, she said softly. I'll help clean up this situation. As Harrison led Daniel toward the garden door, Josephine called after them, Nothing explosive or radioactive, please. Harrison's laugh floated back. Just the boring stuff tonight, I promise. Alone in the kitchen, Josephine began methodically cleaning, finding the familiar task soothing amidst the unfamiliar surroundings. She had just finished wiping down the counters when she noticed a framed photograph tucked behind a canister. Harrison, much younger, with a woman and a small boy around Daniel's age. My wife and son, Harrison's voice came from behind her. Emma and Theo. Josephine startled, carefully replacing the photo. I didn't mean to pry. It's not prying if it's displayed, Harrison said, though his eyes held a sadness that hadn't been there earlier. They died 9 years ago. Car accident. I'm so sorry, Josephine whispered, the simple phrase inadequate for such profound loss. Harrison nodded, accepting her sympathy without elaboration. Daniel's exploring my collection of meteorites. I thought you and I might talk before dinner arrives. He led her to a comfortable sitting area, adjacent to the kitchen, its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a small brook that burbled through the property. As they settled onto opposite ends of a sofa, Harrison seemed to gather his thoughts. I owe you a proper explanation, he began. After Emma and Theo died, I threw myself into work. Horizon grew exponentially. Sustainable energy, medical tech, international expansion. On paper, I was more successful than ever. He smiled wryly. And I was completely empty inside. Josephine watched his face, seeing for the first time the profound loneliness she'd occasionally glimpsed at the diner. 3 months ago, my doctor rather bluntly informed me I was heading for a breakdown if I didn't change something. He suggested I find places where I could just be a person, not a CEO or a billionaire. Harrison's eyes met hers. Rosie's diner was the first place I walked into, and you were the first person who treated me like I was just another human being. Because that's what you were to me, Josephine said simply. Exactly. Harrison leaned forward. Those conversations at that wobbly table became the most honest interactions in my day. I should have told you who I was, but I was afraid of losing that authenticity. So you just, what? Pretended to be an average guy who happens to frequent diners at odd hours. I never claimed to be average, Harrison corrected gently. I just omitted the details about my company and finances. Everything else, my interests, my opinions, my questions about your life, that was all genuine. Josephine considered this. And the gifts for Daniel, the science kit, the books. Perhaps slightly more expensive than I let on, Harrison admitted, but given with the same intention any friend might have, to support something important to you. Before Josephine could respond, the doorbell announced dinner's arrival. They relocated to a casual dining room where Mrs. Winters had laid out containers of Italian food alongside proper china and crystal water glasses, a juxtaposition that somehow perfectly represented the evening's strange balance. Daniel rejoined them, enthusiastically recounting Harrison's collection of space artifacts and the coolest microscope ever. His easy acceptance of their surroundings made Josephine acutely aware of her own discomfort, not with the luxury itself, but with what it represented, a world completely different from her own. As they ate, conversation gradually eased into more familiar territory. Daniel's school projects, a book Harrison had recently enjoyed, a customer who had left Josephine an absurd note about the diner's ketchup selection. It was nearly like their conversations at Rosie's, except for the lingering awareness of where they sat and what remained unresolved between them. After dinner, when Mrs. Winters had taken Daniel to the media room to watch a documentary about Mars, Harrison and Josephine moved to the terrace, the evening air crisp around them. "I can see you rebuilding your walls," Harrison said quietly, "calculating the distance between our lives." Josephine sighed. "Can you blame me? Look at this place, Harrison. Look at my life. 3 jobs just to make ends meet, second-hand everything, constant worry about the future. And you think money eliminates worry?" His voice held no judgment, only curiosity. "No," she admitted, "but it eliminates certain kinds of worry, the kind that keeps you awake, wondering how to pay for your child's asthma medication." Harrison nodded, acknowledging her point. "You're right. Financial security is a privilege I take for granted." He paused. "But it doesn't automatically create meaning or connection. Those nights at Rosie's, watching you manage difficult customers with grace, hearing your stories about Daniel's adventures, that's what made me feel human again." Josephine studied him, seeing beyond the wealth to the man who had sat in her section night after night, listening as though her mundane stories were fascinating. "I don't need rescuing if that's what this is about," she said firmly. "I've built my life through hard work, and while it's not perfect, it's mine." "I would never presume to rescue someone as capable as you," Harrison replied, a hint of admiration coloring his tone. "But is it so impossible to imagine that 2 people from different circumstances might simply enjoy each other's company? That perhaps we each have something valuable to offer the other that has nothing to do with finances?" A comfortable silence settled between them as Josephine considered his words. Beyond the terrace, the sky darkened to indigo, stars appearing one by one. "I don't know where this goes from here," she finally said. "My world and yours, they don't typically intersect." Harrison turned to face her fully. "Then perhaps we create a new space, one that belongs to neither world but accommodates both. Is that even possible?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'd like to try if you're willing. No more omissions, no pretense, just Harrison and Josephine figuring it out one conversation at a time." From inside the house came the sound of Daniel's laughter, bright and uninhibited. Something in the sound seemed to resonate between them, a reminder of what mattered beyond their respective circumstances. "One conversation at a time," Josephine agreed softly. "I think I can manage that." Harrison smiled then, hopeful, genuine, a little uncertain, reminded her of why she'd enjoyed his company from the beginning. Wealth and status aside, he was simply a man seeking connection in a world that had taken too much from him. As they walked back inside to join Daniel, Josephine realized they were indeed building a bridge between their worlds, fragile still, but with foundations stronger than either of them had anticipated. Flourishing together, 6 months passed like turning pages in a well-loved book, not rushed, but flowing naturally from one chapter to the next. Spring blossomed into summer, bringing with it gradual, meaningful changes to Josephine and Daniel's lives. The most significant change came in the form of opportunity rather than charity. Harrison had listened intently one evening as Josephine described her dream of turning her weekend baking hobby into something more substantial. "I've always wanted my own little place," she had admitted. "Nothing fancy, just good coffee, homemade pastries, and a space where people could feel welcome." 2 weeks later, Harrison had arrived at her apartment with a business proposal, a small storefront near Daniel's school, available for lease, and a detailed business plan for what would become Joe's Morning Light Bakery. His investment would be strictly financial, The vision and execution would be entirely hers. A partnership, he had clarified, not a gift. Josephine had hesitated only briefly before accepting. Her pride was substantial, but not foolish. She recognized opportunity when it presented itself, especially one that honored her capabilities rather than diminishing them. Now, on a warm August morning, Josephine wiped flour from her hands as she surveyed her bakery. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the rustic wooden tables she and Daniel had refinished themselves. The display case gleamed, filled with her creations, cinnamon rolls, blueberry scones, and her signature cardamom buns that had developed a loyal following. The bell above the door chimed, and Harrison entered, carrying what appeared to be architectural blueprints. "Morning, boss," he teased, leaning across the counter to kiss her cheek. "You're early," she noted, pouring him a cup of coffee from the carafe, dark roast, 1 sugar, just as he'd always taken it at Rosie's. Harrison spread the blueprints across an empty table. The contractor had questions about the community center expansion. "I thought you might want to weigh in, since the culinary education kitchen was your idea." The Horizon Foundation Community Center had been Harrison's response to learning more about Josephine's neighborhood and its limited resources. Rather than simply writing checks, he had asked Josephine to help design programs that would actually serve local families. After-school activities for children like Daniel, job training for single parents, and classes teaching practical skills like cooking nutritious meals on limited budgets. "Mrs. Winters is bringing Daniel by later to help test recipes for the program," Harrison mentioned, studying Josephine's face with quiet appreciation. "He's quite serious about his role as junior taste tester." Josephine smiled, thinking of how her son had blossomed over the past months. Daniel had always been bright, but Harrison's thoughtful mentorship had nurtured his curiosity in ways Josephine couldn't have provided alone. It wasn't about expensive gifts or opportunities, though there had been some, but rather the simple gift of attention from someone who took his ideas seriously. "You're staring," Josephine noted, feeling a familiar warmth spread across her cheeks. "Admiring," Harrison corrected. "There's a difference." Their relationship had evolved gradually, neither rushing nor resisting the natural progression from friendship to something deeper. Harrison still came to the diner occasionally, though Josephine now worked there just 1 evening a week, partly from nostalgia, partly to maintain her connection with regular customers who had supported her for years. "The zoning board approved the affordable housing project," Harrison said, changing subjects. "Construction starts next month." This project had been particularly important to Josephine, quality housing for working families that wouldn't consume most of their income. She and Harrison had spent countless evenings at her small kitchen table, discussing how to make it viable. With Josephine providing insights no business consultant could have offered about what families like hers actually needed. "Remember when I told you our worlds don't typically intersect?" Josephine asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee and joining him at the table. Harrison nodded, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I was wrong," she continued. "They were always connected. I just couldn't see it from where I stood. Your technology company develops medical devices that people like my neighbor, Mrs. Gonzalez, depends on. My diner serves food to everyone, regardless of what's in their bank account. We just needed to recognize the humanity in each other's experience," Harrison added softly. The morning rush began, and Josephine moved efficiently behind the counter, greeting customers by name as Harrison returned to his blueprints. This had become their comfortable rhythm, parallel work punctuated by shared moments, neither encroaching on the other's independence. Later that afternoon, as the bakery quieted, Josephine found Harrison and Daniel huddled together at a corner table, heads bent over what appeared to be the design for a solar-powered toy car. "If we adjust the angle of the panels," Harrison was explaining, "we can maximize energy absorption even with indirect sunlight." Daniel nodded seriously, making notations with the careful precision of a child determined to be taken seriously. And then it could work even on cloudy days? Exactly. Engineering is all about adapting to real-world conditions. Josephine watched them unobserved for a moment, struck by how naturally they had bonded. Harrison never tried to replace Daniel's father, a man who had chosen to disappear from their lives years ago, but instead offered a different kind of male presence. Reliable, nurturing, intellectually engaging. That evening, after closing the bakery and putting Daniel to bed, Josephine and Harrison sat on the small balcony of her apartment. They had maintained separate residences, each respecting the other's need for personal space and independence. Harrison had helped Josephine find a better apartment closer to Daniel's school. But it was still decidedly modest, by mutual agreement. Their relationship would develop at its own pace, without dramatic changes that might destabilize what they were carefully building. "I have something for you," Harrison said, reaching into his pocket and extracting a small velvet box. Josephine's breath caught. Harrison." He opened it to reveal not a ring, but a key. "To the lake house," he explained. "It's been sitting empty for years. I thought perhaps this weekend, if you and Daniel would like, we could go there together." The significance wasn't lost on Josephine. The lake house had belonged to Harrison's parents and later to him and Emma. It was a place filled with family memories, both joyful and painful. "Are you sure?" she asked. Understanding the emotional weight of the invitation, Harrison nodded, his grey eyes reflecting the soft porch light. "For 9 years, I've been preserving spaces as shrines to what I've lost, afraid to create new memories that might somehow diminish the old ones." He took her hand gently. "You've shown me that honoring the past doesn't mean living there. Emma would have liked you, you know. She had the same quality of seeing people for who they truly are." Josephine accepted the key, feeling its weight, symbolic rather than physical, in her palm. "I would have liked to know her. In some ways, you do," Harrison said. "Through the parts of her that helped shape who I am." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge above the city lights. Josephine reflected on how dramatically her life had changed, yet how she remained fundamentally herself, still working hard, still fiercely protective of Daniel, still independent in her thinking and choices. Harrison hadn't tried to rescue her from her circumstances, but had instead become her partner in reshaping them on her own terms. For his part, Harrison had found his way back to living fully after years of merely existing. Josephine and Daniel hadn't replaced what he'd lost, but had helped him build something new alongside. Those precious memories. A family constellation with a different pattern but equal brightness. "You know," Josephine said quietly, "when people see us together, they probably think this is a story about how you changed my life." Harrison turned to her, eyebrow raised questioningly. "But that's not it at all, is it?" She continued. "This is a story about how we changed each other's lives, because we each had something the other needed." She squeezed his hand. "I needed opportunities, yes, but you needed perspective, a reminder of what matters beyond balance sheets and boardrooms." Harrison's smile deepened. The woman who serves coffee, recognizing the humanity in the man who builds empires. The man who builds empires, valuing the wisdom of the woman who serves coffee. When you put it that way, it sounds almost poetic, Josephine laughed softly. "The best stories usually are," Harrison replied, leaning forward to kiss her gently. Inside, Daniel called out, requesting one more bedtime story. As they rose together to answer him, Josephine felt a profound sense of rightness, not because her life now contained elements of comfort she'd once only dreamed about, but because it contained genuine connection, built on mutual respect and understanding. They had indeed created that new space Harrison had proposed 6 months earlier, one that belonged to neither of their original worlds, but accommodated both perfectly. It wasn't defined by wealth or its absence, but by the values they shared: integrity, hard work, compassion, and the courage to recognize worth in unexpected places. As they entered Daniel's room together, his sleepy smile embracing them both with equal affection, Josephine realized they had built something even more valuable than a bridge between different worlds. They had built a home, not a physical structure, but a constellation of relationships where each person was valued not for what they possessed, but for who they truly were. And that, she thought, as Harrison began reading Daniel's favorite story, was the greatest wealth of all.